Hello and welcome to the Thursday, October 30th, 2025 edition of the SANS Internet Storm Center's Stormcast. My name is Johannes Ulrich, recording today from Jacksonville, Florida. And this episode is brought to you by the SANS.edu Graduate Certificate Program in Cybersecurity Engineering. In Diaries today, we have Jim talk about memory-only file systems on Linux. Sometimes colloquially called RAM disks. Of course, they exist on other operating systems as well. The tricky thing about these memory-only file systems on Linux is that there is no block device associated with those file systems. Often def SHM is a typical location. Sometimes you have also temporary file systems, even /temp, sometimes being mounted as a memory-only file system. The problem now is that DD, your standard tool that you're using to make sort of forensically sound copies of data and similar tools don't work on these memory-only file systems. So Jim is going over a little shell script that he's using in order to deal with those file systems. Yes, it's not ideal in the sense that it doesn't sort of create a bit-by-bit copy of the file system, but instead what Jim is suggesting here is to basically just first use the shell stat command in order to collect basic statistics about the files and then copy individual files. There was a comment on social media that maybe we can do a follow-up diary about this, to be careful with odd file names here as you're passing them to the command line, as Jim suggests. Of course, typically you would first sort of take a quick glance at the directory that you're copying here to make sure that the file names are valid. Nothing really odd happening here with these file names. But yeah, overall, interesting diary here and definitely a valid problem. If anybody has any other better ideas, please let me know. Like I said, we may do a little follow-up on some of the problems around memory-only file systems. And well, another day and another major failure of a cloud provider. This time it's Microsoft with its Azure system. Now, the failure here was a little bit more limited in the sense that it was one specific system that failed, but that system that failed was Azure Front Door, which is the authentication part. So if you're using that to authenticate users for your services, well, then they were not able to reach your services. This has also affected a couple of SANS-related systems. I heard some issues about the exams, for example. Just for that reason, you couldn't authenticate, so you weren't able to actually then connect to the system that relied on this particular authentication scheme. Overall, this should be around now as I'm recording this, go back to normal. I haven't tested myself yet. There was some reports and news that was DNS related. I don't see anything related to DNS in Microsoft's notes here about this particular incident. So I somewhat doubt that this was DNS related. Of course, people compared it to the AWS problem that we had a few days ago. Also, AWS was not affected. The website Down Detector showed some spike in outage reports for AWS as well. Remember, that website is often parsing things like social media posts and the like. And with people comparing this outage to the AWS outage, of course, there were also more mentions of AWS outages, which may have related or led to that spike of reports in the Down Detector graph. So it was only Azure that was affected, not AWS, and we don't know if it was DNS related or not at this point. And then we have an interesting vulnerability in Docker Compose. If you're not familiar with Docker Compose, it's a way how you can script essentially creating systems networks of multiple Docker containers. Now, one of the options here is that you are including remote resources as you're building these containers. And if these resources do contain Open Container Initiative artifacts or OCI artifacts, then they may lead to the creation of files outside of your Docker Compose directory, which they're not supposed to do. Docker Compose, that tool is also used as a backend for tools like Docker Desktop and the like, so it's not just running it standalone where you're affected here. A patch was released. Exploitation is certainly likely in the sense that as you're building these Docker containers using Docker Compose, you often do rely on resources that you're downloading from other sites, from basically others that have created containers that you're using. And as a result, this is certainly something that's somewhat exploitable and should be patched. Also, exploitation at this point is pretty straightforward. Well, that's it for today. So thanks for listening. Thanks for liking this podcast. And as always, thanks for recommending it, and talk to you again tomorrow.